Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our Are You Sitting Comfortably Zoom presentation. The session today is going to be run by Kevin Doyle, who's Chief Commercial Officer at Ascenti, and Elliot Hurst of Hurst Advisory. And Elliot's working with Ascenti in the development of their overall proposition. Kevin was previously a professional footballer with Leeds United and Nottingham Forest, before he suffered a career-ending injury which saw him retrain as a sports physiotherapist before he set up Ascenti. And since then, Ascenti has grown to become the leading provider of physiotherapy services in the UK. And Elliot will be known to many of you as having been both an intermediary and an insurer before he set up his own consulting business, Hurst Advisory. Before we pass over to them, can I just remind you that you can ask questions directly using the chat function. So as we get things underway, I'm assuming that you are sitting comfortably, and I'll pass you over to Kevin and Elliot to enable them to get the session underway. So gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. Thank you for those kind words, Stuart, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us on what is, by the way, here in South London, a particularly grey, cold and wet Tuesday morning. Thanks for those. What we're going to do here is my work with Ascenti over the last year or so has exposed me to what they do, and in particular the work around virtual and remote physiotherapy. We've got a couple of recent surveys, one of which isn't necessarily out there in the public domain as yet, but we're going to release it through you guys today and give you some interesting statistics on it. We'll run for about 20 minutes. As I say, pop through any questions. Michael will fire them through to me, and we'll either take them during the presentation or collate them at the end and bring it all together. But around about 20 minutes of presentation, then some time for Q&A. Before we go any further, one question that's probably on your mind, and this is a question that was on my mind a year or so ago when I was invited by the chairman of Ascenti to help them develop their proposition and move into the medical insurance and related spaces that all of us know so well, is who is Ascenti? And so my first question to Kevin, who's the Chief Commercial Officer over at Ascenti, is, Kevin, tell us a little bit about Ascenti, who you are, what you do, and maybe put some numbers around the number of people that you see as patients each and every year. So Kevin, just a couple of numbers, please, and some background on Ascenti.
Yeah, absolutely. Morning, everyone. So Ascenti have actually been established now for over 20 years. We're a 40 million turnover business with circa 7 million EBITDA. We're actually now one, if not the largest employer of physiotherapists outside the large hospital groups in the UK. So we employ directly 300 full-time physiotherapists who operate from 400 Ascenti sites nationwide. We deliver over 600,000 physio sessions per annum, and we have an Ascenti site within a 5-mile radius of 90% of the working population of the UK. So accessibility is absolutely key in terms of the clinical network set up. We do operate across the full plethora of MSK sectors. So we operate within the medical, legal and motor insurance, working with partners such as Victoria and Admiral. We operate in the NHS with partnering with 20 CCG groups. And we also deliver services into OH outsourcing, so working with partners such as Optima, Medigold and Jor Diamond Health Partners. And we also deliver into the PMI sector and provide significant numbers and provision to partners like Aviva and Vitality, among others. I think over the last 24 months, we've invested very heavily in our digital solutions, which offer us really the ability to offer highly flexible working partnerships with insurers and other clients. And that has meant that we've been able to launch virtual physio as well as other digital health products ahead of the rest of the marketplace in our view.
Thanks for that, Kevin. That's a really useful overview. And as I say, a year or so ago, before I started working with Ascenti, like many of us from the medical insurance sector, I didn't necessarily know who we were and what we did. It was a name that was unfamiliar to many. So, we're hoping that along with today and other work that we're doing, that we're bringing that Ascenti brand more to the fore. Ascenti is recognised by all the major medical insurers. At one point there, just to build on what Kevin said, is they were selected or are now the preferred partner, the sole partner in the digital musculoskeletal space with Vitality. And part of the work we've done with Vitality will lean on today to bring the whole concept of virtual physiotherapy to life. So Kevin, I think we all now know we're in a very different world given COVID and the lockdown and things that move each and every day around us. A difficult world for many people to navigate in, but it's also been a very changed and different world for us who work in private medical insurance. I mean, we all know that a lot of care simply hasn't been available until very recently. And it's only just now, but with very different protocols, very different working environments, lots of PPE, lots of risk management now put in place to mitigate the impact of COVID, that private healthcare is starting to open up again. Ascenti, I know, recently surveyed around about 2,000 people who had worked from home for the very first time since the lockdown was imposed. And there were some really telling stats that came through in that. Perhaps you could just give us an overview of some of the headline stats from our survey of people working from home in COVID for the first time, please.
Yeah, of course. I think that, the headline really question was around our home workers sitting comfortably. And I think as we'll start to see from the data and the information that we gathered, the majority of people are simply not sitting comfortably and are not in a comfortable position while they're working from home. So not surprising to anyone on the call, I'm sure, that 48% of the UK workforce have worked from home since lockdown measures have been put in place, which is actually double the number that had ever previously worked from home prior to that point. So a tenfold increase in the number of people working from home compared to those who mainly work from home prior to these measures being put in place. So I think when we start to consider the challenge for businesses to recalibrate their business and actually move individuals, the logistics of making that happen in that period of time is obviously incredibly challenging. And so it was unsurprising in many ways that only 30% of those currently working from home have exclusive use of an office desk and or adjustable office chair. With, interestingly, females notably less likely to have access to appropriate equipment when working from home. And so when we actually look at I suppose the lack of consistency in the positioning, over 72% currently work from home and working on their sofa, 56% from their beds, 39% using a floor as a desk, 33% using a stool as a desk, and 25% using a beanbag as a desk. So I've only got 4 or 5 people I can see on the call here, but I'm sure there's many people on this call that can probably resonate with some of these workstation positions. And I think some of them are very unorthodox. I think, I was very surprised that 25% of people are using a beanbag, I have to be honest, as a desk. And as a result of that, 49% of all respondents to the survey are experiencing more physical pain since lockdown measures have come into place. So 19% with low back pain, 18% with more neck pain, 18% with tightness across their shoulders and in their elbows, and then 15% have additional pain in their hands, fingers, and wrists. So considering that this survey was conducted in mid-April, so lockdown measures had only been put in place really for a little over a month at that stage, really high numbers, in my opinion, of MSK issues starting to come out of the statistics here.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I mean, look, there are some of us could raise a wry smile and look at some of the statistics like using a beanbag or working in bed, working on your sofa, etc. I'm sure a number of people have done that at some point during the last couple of weeks and months. I think looking at it more seriously, I guess there's 2 angles here. If I were, a broker or an insurer in our marketplace, is firstly, will working from home become the new norm? So, I think certainly a lot of larger employers potentially now are starting to look at the cost savings that could come by deploying people who may have worked typically in an office space on a permanent basis at a particular location, that actually now, well, if working from home can work, and if we can get the technology set up, and if we can get their home working environment set up correctly, then a number of employees may not work in an office, in a traditional office space, 5 days a week in a traditional kind of manner. It could be a mix and match of 1 or 2 days in an office space and maybe the rest of the week working from home. Obviously, those of us, and particularly many on this call who've worked in the sales kind of field, have traditionally worked from home or worked on the road. And so many of these things will not be a concern to us, but certainly for those who are used to working in an office, there could be a challenge here. And we certainly need to look at home workplace adjustments is probably the phrase that I'd be looking at. The second one, which is most obviously, is are we storing up quite a number of PMI claims here? So if this is reflected across our client base, across our policyholder base, will there be a number of PMI claims starting to come through? And if they are starting to come through in the musculoskeletal space, how might we deal with them? And that sort of leads us on to virtual and remote physiotherapy, which we'll touch on in the second half of our presentation today. Kevin, just very briefly, as a clinician yourself, as a qualified physiotherapist, you look at these kind of statistics in very headline terms. What's your perspective on what you're seeing here? What are the concerns that you're looking at? What are the kind of things that would be in your mind as a clinician?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've touched on a number of key points there, Elliot. For me, yeah, and quite interestingly, in terms of the feedback, and understandably over this period, individuals and to a large extent businesses are not prioritizing MSK health to a large, and I can understand that to a large extent. I think as we move forward, there may well have been the anticipation that the lockdown measures and this working from home will be shorter term, when compared to the actual fact that this will be an extended period of time. And I think people will now need to start prioritizing their MSK health by looking at their work, their working from home environment, and also addressing any MSK issues that has arisen, to this point. It's not surprising that it's everything is related to spine and upper limb. That's something we would absolutely expect. I think from a clinical standpoint, we would always advocate early intervention. So when individuals start to experience MSK issues in normal environments, we would typically advocate early intervention to minimize those conditions developing and manifesting into more subacute and chronic conditions. And that's how we, under normal circumstances, that's how we absolutely limit the number of work absences, etc. I do anticipate there being a spike in MSK related claims and MSK related patients coming across all industries into our business over the coming months. And I think we need to be quite careful here not to to manage this build up, in my opinion, to actually ensure that we don't see quite a significant spike in work-related absence coming to the end of the year and into early 2021.
Thanks for that, Kevin. That's a really useful insight from a clinical perspective. And just one other point, for those of you who might be thinking, can we see a copy of this survey? The answer is yes. I mean, you can access it on the Ascenti website. But equally, what we'll do is through Stuart and Michael and through the AMII team, we'll make sure that the copy of this survey comes out to you, so you've got it for future reference and for use with your clients. That's not a problem. Before we go on, we're going to show you a quick demo video in a short while of around what virtual physiotherapy looks like, to try and bring it to life for you. But what's also coming out is we had this survey, our home workers sitting comfortably a couple of weeks or so ago. We've got a second paper coming out shortly, which is a white paper on virtual physiotherapy. And just to give you some headlines here, we're literally about to release it. This is the first time we've talked about it publicly. So Ascenti has undertaken a study of just over 27,000 patients. Now, each of these patients within the time period you can see here for the year for June 2019 to start of the current month, would have touched our virtual physiotherapy, our remote physiotherapy service in some way, shape or form. So some of these patients would have used it on a mixed and match basis between traditional face-to-face care and virtual and remote care. Some of them would have had a purely virtual and remote care pathway. So they would have interacted with their physio through a camera, through a telephone, with the use of the app and the use of the supporting materials that sit behind that. I think one other point just to bear in mind here is clearly, as we look at that time period, that includes probably a good, I think it's probably about 10 to 12 weeks, maybe 10 weeks or so of the COVID-19 lockdown. So not only have you got a normal kind of world prior to mid-March 2020, but then certainly we've got a very different and changed world, which we're all experiencing for the period March through to the start of June of this year. So there are a couple of key findings. So two key findings to begin with. Firstly, in terms of virtual and remote physiotherapy, and you can see there how that might work on someone's smartphone on the left there, analysing all of the data that we've got over the last year, what came out, quite pleasant surprise to us, was that a combined face-to-face and virtual care pathway, so that's where a patient would have both face-to-face, traditional, in-person, hands-on physical setting, and combining that with a number of virtual and remote consultations, actually delivered the very best clinical outcomes. They were around about 10% better than patients who went through a purely face-to-face face-to-face treatment pathway, and around about another 10% better than those who are purely virtual. Now, that was across all clinical settings, all kinds of pain perceptions of patients and alike. If we look at a second key finding, which is the one beneath it here on the right-hand side of your screen, is that if you were to treat people in a purely virtual and remote manner, so using the camera, using the materials, using the tools, using the app, telephonic, etc., then certainly where people are have perceptions of a low or medium pain threshold when they come to physiotherapy for their musculoskeletal pain, then that virtual only pathway is proving to be pretty much as effective as anything else out there. So I think the conclusion you can draw here at a very early stage is that a combined face-to-face and virtual pathway is good for everyone, and certainly for those who have low and medium pain perceptions, a virtual pathway where they don't need to see someone in person necessarily can deliver very, very effective and positive clinical outcomes. We'll touch on that in a moment, because I think that's a really important point to bear in mind, particularly as the new world of healthcare that we're looking at will often mean that a face-to-face traditional typical environment that we might have expected to use commonly up until January, February, March of this year will look very, very different in the months and years to come, until such time as COVID is resolved as a pandemic. Let's bring this more to life now. So Laura in the background will do her magic now, and we're going to bring this to life by just showing you a very quick video on what virtual and remote physiotherapy care looks like. That's great. Thank you for that, Laura. That's really useful, and I hope hopefully that brings a virtual and remote physiotherapy to life a little more for our attendees today. I think if I were to reflect on it based on my background in medical insurance, both on the insurer and the broking side, what you're seeing here is possibly quite similar in some respects to what we would have seen 2, 3, 4 years ago when virtual and remote private GP services, so the likes of Babylon and Doctor at Hand at PPP and other various providers out there, all the medical insurers grasped it and ran with it, and it seems to have worked very well. I think early on, a number of us were possibly slightly skeptical as to whether virtual and remote GP consultations could work for the vast majority of our clients and their conditions and their inquiries and queries around their healthcare. I think if you've been like me, once you've touched it, you probably wouldn't go back too readily to face-to-face GP appointments, because frankly, just based on a convenience factor alone, accessing care on a virtual and remote basis just makes it so much easier than having to be at a particular place at a particular time to see a particular doctor. Clearly that might be an option that you want to have down the line, but certainly virtual and remote GP services seem to have worked well. And I think here, this is what we're seeing around physiotherapy as it starts to emerge as well. So Kevin, that video and was a really useful overview, but tell us from a patient perspective, from a policyholder and a client perspective, what do our patients think of virtual physiotherapy when they've been through it? Do we have any stats on that, please?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that the vast majority of our patients have absolutely embraced and have benefited and fed that back to the organisation in terms of virtual physio. I think you've just touched on there, Elliot, the convenience factor and not having to leave the house and book time off work. So the accessibility of a virtual physio appointment is exceptionally better than having to attend a face-to-face session. Interestingly enough, the digital tools, so when we talk about virtual physiotherapy, for me, it's not simply putting a physiotherapist on a camera in front of a patient. There's so much more that works behind that in terms of the digital solutions that support that session and thereafter. What we found is individual patients that engage with the technology and the app-based technology within their rehabilitation program, the compliance is higher and the clinical outcomes are actually better. So we have found that patients who access the video demonstrations after their session achieve better clinical results overall. And interestingly, our clinician feedback has been very much around the compliance factor of patients engaging in their self-management programs. As a clinician, I know historically that is problematic and a challenge to ensure our patients are empowered to take away their self-management programs and really work on those and comply with those. What we're starting to find is patients that do not have the manual intervention and they know they're not going to see a physiotherapist really engage more so in the self-rehabilitation program, and the fact they can access the videos and access that information after the session. We've seen overall some significant benefits for our patients in that. Some statistics to actually back that up. Within the pending white paper that we're producing, 92% of patients who experience virtual care and support were satisfied or very satisfied with the effectiveness of the care. And 95% of the same patient group will be extremely likely to recommend virtual physio to their friends and family. So I think you'll agree there's some very impressive stats coming back from our patients.
No, thank you for that, Kevin. I think they're very compelling statistics. So it's all very well us from a clinical and maybe an insurer or a broking and advisory capacity to say this is a good thing, but what do the patients, what do our customers and clients think about it? And if these are the numbers that are coming back, then again, we're going in the right direction. Just one very brief point here as well, or one other brief point to pick up on what Kevin said. Really important that, yes, it's all very well that a physio might be able to talk to you through a camera, might be able to talk to you through the phone, etc. But what are the support mechanisms and what are the other tools that sit around that remote consultation that would allow the patient, our policyholder, our client, to actually engage properly with the rehabilitation, with the exercises that they've been prescribed, in order to make sure that the physiotherapy treatment that's being paid for potentially by their medical insurer actually becomes meaningful and curative. And so I think, again, you've seen there from the video with Ascenti that some of those tools and support mechanisms are very much there to ensure that the care can be remote, but equally that the patient can take the lead on the self-management and achieve a better clinical outcome than might otherwise be the case. Just very briefly before we start to wrap up, I'll just touch on where I think the medical insurers are on this. And I think it's fair to say that the medical insurers maybe a couple of years ago wouldn't have necessarily looked at virtual and remote physiotherapy as something that was out there that they would fund eligible benefit for. That has definitely changed. Clearly, the work we've done with Vitality has changed their position within the last year. And we've seen pretty much all the other medical insurers now reach a point where virtual and remote physiotherapy clearly is something that they would recognize for benefit. One question I had posed to me recently by a friend in the industry is, well, what do you think maybe in a year or so's time, when we might be out of COVID and we might be back into a more normal, a normalized environment? Well, I think that's a very good question. And will the insurers continue to fund benefit at that point in time? I think they probably will, in the same sense that with virtual GP consultations, once people have touched it, once people have felt it, once they've benefited from it, and once they found that it's convenient and it works for them, I don't think as an industry we would necessarily rein back on therapy as being an eligible benefit under your medical insurance, or indeed potentially under your cash plan. Let's not forget that adjacent space to us as well, where clearly physiotherapy is a key part of the benefits available. So as we look to wrap up here, look into the future, Kevin, clearly the way in which our clients and policyholders will interact with healthcare of all kinds is going to change rapidly as a result of the protocols that are now in place around COVID-19. From a physiotherapy perspective, what's the near future on delivery of physiotherapy in both a face-to-face setting and then also in terms of a remote and virtual setting, what might that look like? And what are you doing as a business to prepare for that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short and medium term, obviously the clinical setting, the physical clinical setting will look very different for people. And, you know, there's obviously a very, very in-depth pre-screening process individuals will need to come through in order to qualify, in order to go into a face-to-face environment. You've got the use of PPE, which obviously will have some impact therapeutically in terms of the interaction between clinician and patient. And you've got the fear of patients as well, and looking at how that over time starts to reduce. I mean, we are starting to see 60+% of individuals offered a face-to-face appointment accepting that, so that's really positive, and we'd like to see that improving as we move forward. I think from a clinical pathway perspective, pre-COVID, we always anticipated that there would be a multi-channel delivery solution offered across various industries. And what I mean by that is the ability to deliver a combination of virtual and face-to-face. I think how we have envisioned our pathways working, the selection process and the assessment process at the front end is absolutely critical, that you choose the right patient using the right clinical objective measures to make sure that if you do select that individual patient to go down a purely virtual pathway, you're optimizing their chances of recovery really by selecting the right and the most appropriate patient. So, you know, I think from our research and data, it is clear that a combination of both innovative digital tools and not just video technology, we're talking about the whole piece, and having an MSK delivery solution that's fully digitally enabled, and combining that with quality in-person treatment is absolutely for us. It offers the highest possibility of optimal recovery for individual patients.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I mean, and just to stress one or 2 points coming out of Kevin's answer there, you know, the world of healthcare will look very, very different moving forward. It may be very intimidating and quite frightening to a number of our clients and policyholders. I think that's probably natural to expect that to be the case, certainly for a period of time. And so therefore, the ability to mix and match in person and virtual and remote, or have a purely virtual and remote pathway in order to help you with your musculoskeletal condition is probably the way to go. So before we close up here, Kevin, do you have 3 or 4 potential key hints and tips for the AMII membership around this whole new world of working from home and how musculoskeletal care interacts with that as well, please?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you know, nothing revolutionary here. I think you've probably read a number of different things in terms of advice. We've touched on this. I think environment is absolutely key. For me, it's trying to achieve consistency in that working environment when you're working from home, looking at your desk and workstation area and just making sure it's in as an optimal position as possible. You could look to have what we call a home working health check, or a virtual DSC assessment to make those changes. Sometimes even small adjustments can make significant benefits. And I would advocate regular exercises around posture and you know, looking at that seat and laptop adjustment and making sure it's in the optimal position. Take regular breaks. We recommend 10 minutes every 2 hours as a minimum. Try and obviously have that 10 minutes outside if you can, and incorporate any type of stretching exercises that you can. I mean, you know, we're looking at lumbar spine, upper limb issues here predominantly. So again, some very, very simple exercises that you can start to incorporate into your breaks throughout the day. Exercise, we do recommend some form of exercise in the day. So it could be a walk, for example, in your lunch break. You know, I know I'm guilty of, you know, not leaving my desk sometimes for the entire day. So I'm great at giving the advice, but sometimes taking the advice, not so great. You know, there's other ways of convenient workouts now, like virtual yoga and virtual Pilates, etc., which are, I think, really, really beneficial at the moment in terms of those stretching exercises and looking at the spinal area in particular. And you have got the stress decrease benefits from that type of exercise. One recommendation I would make is actually a rebounder. So some people who are childminding or have childminding issues and they can't leave the house, for example, actually using a rebounder at home, and even for 10-15 minutes has a huge amount of benefits. that can be obtained by simply using that for a short period each day. And then last but not least is actually see a physiotherapist if you do have an issue that's developed that isn't subsiding over 3-4 weeks with the adjustments, etc. I would recommend having a virtual physiotherapy consultation, have the right level of exercise prescribed for your particular issue, and actually look to address those issues before they start to manifest into more subacute and chronic conditions.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I really appreciate that. Just before I hand back to Stuart, just one or two other points to reinforce. We will make available to you copies of both surveys, the survey and the white paper on virtual physiotherapy, which we're about to release to the marketplace. A copy of this presentation will also be hosted by AMII, and if we've recorded it correctly, you'll be able to watch this back or pass on the link to your colleagues as well in order to watch this webinar back. Just 2 or 3 points to finish from my perspective, from a PMI kind of broking perspective. Is great to know that virtual and remote physiotherapy care is out there. Great to know that it's eligible as a benefit, and I suspect it will be eligible as a benefit and under cover for quite some time to come, if not permanently. The ability to mix and match face-to-face care and virtual care not only gives a great clinical outcome, but might also be better for our patients, given the very and our policyholders, given the very different world of healthcare that they're going to see until COVID-19 is removed from the world, shall we say. It's great to hear that our patients and policyholders like it and they benefit from it, and they think it's convenient and it's good for them, and they'd recommend it. Very similar there to virtual GP. And then finally, it's important that people have options in their healthcare moving forward, because we're not going to be in the normal world of healthcare as we would have all known for many years. And so the ability to transact and receive and deliver healthcare on a virtual basis is one that I think many people will welcome. So at that point, Kevin and I will say thank you. We'll wrap up our formal presentation, and I'll pass it back to Stuart and Michael, and maybe there'll be some questions out there from the floor that we can take in the next couple of minutes. Stuart.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Michael, so have you received any questions through the chat function?
Yes, I have had a couple come through, Stuart. This one's probably for Kevin. Is after the virtual consultation, what tools and materials would the patient have access to? And also, for how long after the consultation do they have access to those materials?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in terms of accessibility, they've access after discharge for 6 months post their discharge. So within the app itself, so they have your virtual consultation. You're then actually prescribed the exercise program. So there's many apps out there that has exercises into the app itself. What we have is an integration between our case management system and the app itself. So when you have a virtual consultation with an Ascenti clinician, they may only select 2 exercises out of the 3,500 that are available, for example, and they will be able to really bespoke and prescribe that exercise program to the individual needs. When the individual actually completes the assessment, they can then access that, obviously, and look at the videos and be able to feedback in terms of how they're actually getting on with the exercises. The clinician can actually see compliance levels, how many times the individual has accessed it, etc. If they're having problems, if during any stage there's an increase in symptomology, we can adjust that program as well. And then obviously for any follow-ups, the individual clinician has some valuable information on the rehab program itself through the app, so they can adjust the prescription accordingly at that point. They then have access for 6 months afterwards.
Just to add something to that very briefly, Michael, sorry. When we were talking to the medical insurers about virtual and remote physiotherapy, one of their first kind of comments back, maybe objections, was, well, it's all very well, Elliot, having this remote consultation, but how do I know that he's doing the exercises? Well, to Kevin's point there, actually our physiotherapists can see if Elliot or Michael or Stuart or Kevin has done his exercises. And then also, just as importantly, are they telling us by doing those exercises that their health is improving or not? So the first point is, are they complying with what they've been asked to do? The second point is it working? If the answer to the first one is no, well, we know it's not going to work. And if the answer to the second one is no, then we need to take that back in and consider if the right treatment or the right exercises have been given in the first place. So actually, to answer a skeptical commercial director at medical insurer's view, actually you have got that mechanism behind this that actually can can prove whether that they are doing their exercises and whether it's working, which means it's a more efficient and better spend of benefit by the insurer.
Okay, I've had an interesting point come through which perhaps follows on from this, and it's looking at the wider opportunities and whether there are opportunities for the use of artificial intelligence with virtual physiotherapy.
Yeah,
Kevin, do you want to say that with triage respect to begin with?
You know, absolutely. I think we need to be a little bit careful about using the word AI. I often hear that term used, and I think, you know, depending on how you interpret it, but we have got a number of tools in the MSK industry around digital triage, which is effectively an algorithm built triage system that the individual can interact with, similar to Babylon, etc. So I think in direct response, absolutely, I think we can start to use the rich data that we're starting to gather on clinical outcomes to actually help support the development of AI specific tools in triage, for example, in terms of helping us select the most appropriate pathway for individuals effectively, and individual patients. So I do see over the next couple of years the implementation. I know we will be looking very heavily on implementing a robust clinical triage that may well be supported through AI and data that's been gathered through our patient cohorts.
Okay, thank you for that. I've sort of got a couple of questions on perhaps what you call the sort of nuts and bolts of accessing the service. First of all, can you explain what the referral options are? Can a patient self-refer to the service? And
Yeah.
Secondly, what is the cost of a virtual consultation? How does that compare to face-to-face consultations? And typically, how many virtual consultations are you seeing that a patient needs to complete an episode of treatment?
Yeah, quite a few questions there. I'll try and remember them all. But yeah, I've got, people can self-refer, of course. I think there was some detail on the final slide, but we can provide that to the AMII members if required. We're typically a B2B organization, so all the same standard pathways of referral we accept into the organization. I think one of the technical benefits that we've developed is the ability to directly book. So within a B2B platform and actually a B2C platform, you can directly book a virtual consultation with Ascenti, which again leads to even further convenience for individuals trying to access the care. In terms of pricing, there is typically a reduced price. It depends really in which area of the country you're looking at from a self-pay perspective. But I think for simplicity, you're looking on average at around £42 to £45 for a face-to-face consultation. You're looking at approximately £35 for a virtual consultation. The average treatment IA, which is an initial assessment to treatment ratio in a face-to-face environment, is typically somewhere around IA +4, +4.5 sessions on average. We are seeing slightly reduced in virtual at around IA +2 on average.
Okay, I think that, one last question that has sort of come through. You mentioned earlier about a home workstation assessment.
Yeah.
Is that something that your organisation could offer? Do you have a template document that employers can use to do a workstation assessment?
Yeah, we've kept it quite simple actually, and what we've looked to do within the virtual consultations during COVID is actually offer a home working health check, where we'll actually assess the individual's home working environment, etc., as part of their consultation or their overall consultation. Of course, when you start to look at more of the more formal reviews like the virtual DSC assessments, etc., that's definitely something that we can look at as an organisation.